Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival and to tonight's presentation, which I think will be interesting and extremely current given the time we're living in. I think the American president wished we were at the Fringe Festival, but we're not yet the Fringe. We're still here to talk about it. My name is David McCraw. I am the Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times. I function as the principal newsroom lawyer at the paper. I'd like to thank the New York Times for its support of this festival and this event. And I would like to especially thank our sponsor tonight, the Edinburgh Academy. The generosity makes programs like this possible. Let me say a little bit about the format for tonight. There's a lot of you, but we're going to try to take as many questions as we can. We'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of questions. If you want to make a speech, please go outside and do so, but ask a question here. I'm delighted to be with Alan Rusbridger. All of you know him for the brilliant job he did as the editor at The Guardian for over 20 very, very chaotic years, both for journalism and for the survival of news organizations. And with that, Alan, in reading your book, I was struck by the fact that you begin by talking about truth, and you end by talking about truth, and you don't seem to be a particularly big fan of the concept of truth, at least as a concept. You raise the question in the first 12 pages. Many of us may be surprised to be asking the most basic question imaginable. How do you know if something is true or not? And a few pages later, you're quoting Carl Bernstein that what we should be talking about is the best obtainable version of the truth. As somebody who just wrote a book called Truth in Our Times, I could not convince my publisher to use the title, The Best Obtainable Version of the Truth in Our Times. It just didn't quite fit, but should we shut up about truth?
Well, I think journalism's got a big credibility problem at the moment. And I shy away from overselling what we can do. I mean, it's quite interesting now. I'm in academia. I'm at Oxford, and I move with scientists and historians and social scientists and lawyers. And I asked a few of them the other day, and they all shy away from the word truth. Even historians who've got sort of 500 years to sift through documents, they nearly all prefer the word evidence. And I think it's a big claim for journalism to be saying, we've got the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I don't think people believe it. So we can be truthful and we can aspire to get near the truth, but I was always slightly nervous about, it's a big word, truth.
You quote David Broder and talk about how 30 years ago his words so affected you. And what he said is, I'm going to truncate this a bit. The daily news report is partial, hasty, incomplete, and somewhat flawed and inaccurate. The process involves not just objective facts, but subjective judgments, personal values, and yes, prejudice. And I think you come to the conclusion that we should be honest about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you talk to any journalist, you read them those words and say it's partial, it's incomplete, and error-ridden. But we will come back and correct it. We'll come back tomorrow, we'll come back in an hour's time, we'll come back in a minute's time. This is how social media works. If something goes wrong on social media, generally somebody will point it out and it will be corrected within minutes. The average length of a time for a newspaper to have a correction dragged out of it can be months. So I think the more people are used to this business, which never existed in history before, the ability of everybody in this room to communicate with each other and to publish, the more a different set of norms is settling in, and people are getting accustomed to different ideas about how you work out if something's true or not. And part of that is conversation and exchange and dialogue, and people are not going to accept tablets of stone any longer being handed down and saying this is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You spend a lot of time in your book focused on the survival of The Guardian. what the newspaper, what the then news website had to do in an age dominated by the platforms. And I'm going to use a hypothetical, assume a hypothetical newspaper starts a campaign based on truth, saying the truth is hard and the truth is worth it. That would be the New York Times is the hypothetical there. We run this campaign over and over again saying truth is hard. Don't we have to do that when we have a president saying fake news? Don't we have to resort to bumper slogans? I get what you're saying, and I agree with it.
I mean, if I was doing a marketing slogan, I might take a different view. But what the book is trying to do is to actually say, well, what is news, and who gets to do it, and who gets to call themselves a journalist? And in this world of information chaos, how can we persuade people that there are people who are quite good at uncovering evidence and truths, and being truthful and informing the world? And I don't think that battle is remotely won yet. So I think the more you can try and pare it back and rethink what journalism is, then that's the best way of being hopeful about its future.
But let's cut to what I think is the bad news, and you quote this in your book, that you cite a poll that 2/3 of people can't separate good journalism from fiction.
Or any good source from any bad source.
Right. So where does that leave us in terms of what journalists should be doing?
Well, we have to win. We have to. I mean, we're not the only people in society who are facing this problem. This problem of how you make people trust us, and I think simply repeating, "Look, we're journalists. You must trust us," doesn't work. The way academics do it is with things like footnotes. They say, "Well, don't trust my word for it. This is how I have discovered this piece of information." The way scientists do it is to say, well, I will tell you how I did my experiment so you can repeat it and satisfy yourself. And I think as journalists, we have to begin to think of techniques like that to expose our workings and be ready to defend it much more openly, rather than live behind high walls and sort of throw the truth over the wall and say, look, we're from The Guardian or the New York Times, trust us. Some people will, but a lot of people won't.
Let me shift a little bit here and talk about some of the things that you were intimately involved with as the editor. The title today is Truth Costs Money, and I have no objection to using truth there as well. But I want to talk about truth first, then we can talk about the money part, which is kind of a fascinating part of your book of what it took to survive and what it took to create the foundation of having a news organization that's going to survive for many years afterwards. Julian Assange, back in the news. You continue to follow the case. And the U.S. government renders an indictment against Julian Assange, saying that he worked with Private Manning to actually try to engage in hacking. He's not a great hacker, didn't actually work. I think at the New York Times, and I cover this in my book, we had assumed that he was essentially one step removed from his source, that he was in all important aspects a journalist of some fashion. Bill Keller used to say, not my kind of journalist, but a journalist of some fashion. Does that change your view of what The Guardian did and The Times did in publishing those documents? Would you have felt differently in 2010 had you known, if assuming the allegation is correct, that Assange had actually worked closely in the hacking?
Well, when he was first accused, they've now laid on a huge extra layer of charges, which is the Espionage Act. But when he was first accused and they moved to extradite him, I thought it was terribly mild. So there were essentially two things he was accused of. One was saying to Chelsea Manning, "Can you get me more?"
Mm-hmm.
She had by now handed over many thousands of documents. And he said, "I would like more." Well, I bet lots of your reporters, lots of my reporters have done that to a source and said, "This is amazing stuff, can we have more of it?" So that doesn't strike me as, if that was a reporter, what we might call a proper reporter.
One of you, say a Guardian reporter.
We'd say, I can completely understand that. The second bit, we can't really understand yet. but there's one explanation of the charge which says actually what he was trying to do was help Chelsea Manning disguise her footsteps.
Correct.
And so he was saying, look, let's work out if we can find another password and get it in through this system instead of that system. Well, again, is that the worst thing in the world to try and protect a source? I mean, I speak from somebody who, I really don't like Julian Assange, and he really doesn't like me. So, I mean, he really doesn't like me.
Well, I think you make the point in the book, the closer you get to Julian Assange, the more he's going to dislike you.
I mean, he falls out with everybody, and the people he falls out with most are the people who consider themselves sort of slightly on his side. But on the other hand, I think there's a big principle here. And I think you have to sort of get beyond the personality and say, if they pick him off for that, that's going to be very bad for people you and I might recognize more conventionally as reporters.
Did you struggle back then with the idea that he was? Did you think of him as a reporter or a journalist? Did you think of him as a source?
He was everything. He was an anarchist. I mean, he's an information anarchist. He's a publisher. He's an entrepreneur. He's a whistleblower. He's an activist. He's an editor. He's a salesman. I mean, so he's got this chameleon-like ability to be different things at different times. And I think that's why the law and states find him so hard to deal with, and why journalists find him so hard to defend. But there's something at the heart of what he was doing that is going to be part of the media landscape in perpetuity, I think. And we have to work out as journalists where we want to stand with him.
I've had the misfortune of defending what happened in 2010. I have no problem as a lawyer, I have no problem as a patriotic American with the way things happened. We then roll forward to 2016, and Assange now is providing documents from the Democratic National Committee, and there's at least the possibility that there was coordination with a foreign government. And so my misfortune is that his lawyers constantly quote me talking about 2010 to defend his activities in 2016, which I certainly don't support. But would that be a tipping point for you if you found out that a source like Assange was working with the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans and coordinating? And as an editor, how would you have dealt with that?
Well, I always took the view when I was editing that a source's motives were interesting up to a point. But in the end, especially if you had documents, I mean, documents are wonderful things to have, and eventually the documents themselves tell you a story, regardless of the source's motives. I mean, lots of sources have got very mixed motives and sometimes bad motives for leaking stuff. And I've wrestled with this because I think, I mean, an awful lot of media outlets in America in 2016 published the stuff. They didn't say, I'm sorry, we don't want to know because we suspect where this is coming from. They looked at the documents and thought, this is actually quite interesting. This should be in the public domain. So part of me, and I'm quite glad I wasn't editing that, because I think part of you would have thought, but is he just becoming now a sort of a stool pigeon for the KGB? But nevertheless, these are quite interesting documents. You know, it's the same thing with the Christopher Steele dossier on Trump. You know, on one hand, a lot of editors sat on that and said, well, we can't publish that because we don't know it's all true. And when BuzzFeed did publish it, I was sort of rather on BuzzFeed's side. I thought, well, why have you shielded me from all this? Why can't you let me know? So you get into these big, profound questions about gatekeepers. And fundamentally, Assange doesn't believe in gatekeepers. He just wants the information all to be out there and for all us to make our minds up. Well, I don't go with him that far. But these are very fuzzy boundaries that we're going to have to argue about for the next 20 years, 30 years.
At least. Let me move to Snowden. Snowden, of course, distrusted the New York Times, felt the New York Times was too willing to talk to the U.S. government about things, which we had done when the WikiLeaks, when the Assange documents came. I think it was misunderstood. They didn't have a veto power, but in the normal course of events, we talk to whomever we're writing about and take into consideration their point of view. Snowden instead decides the Times can't be trusted and good for you, ends up going to The Guardian. What should happen to Snowden? I mean, he turned over classified documents that violated the law. He's sitting in Russia. There's an indictment awaiting him back in the Eastern District of Virginia, the United States. Should journalists defend him and say he should get a pass for what he did?
Definitely, in my view. I mean, Snowden is completely different from Assange. So Assange eventually just published everything because he didn't really like journalists, didn't believe in them. Snowden did this remarkable thing, which was to hand over a disk and say, look, I've taken this stuff, I'm giving it to you, you make the decision, and I will now play no more part in it. So he was very respectful of the traditional role of editing and sifting of the press. And my view is that the more we think about what Snowden was trying to tell us, these are immensely important issues about, so we all of us in this room share our most intimate secrets with Google or Facebook or Twitter or whoever, or WhatsApp, kind of on the basis, I think, that we think, I don't know what we think, we sort of think, I'm not sure who knows this, but I'm assuming these companies are going to keep this information to themselves. If it transpires that all these companies are sharing that information with the state, that's a different kind of contract. Very, very fundamental. I mean, we're all getting hyperventilated about the behavior of Facebook at the moment and its interference in or impact on the electoral process. So the stuff that Snowden was trying to tell us, hold on, I'm waving this big red flag about what your governments are doing behind your back with your information. I think that was a very brave and noble thing to have done, and he's paid a very high price for it. And I think my guess is that in decades to come, he will be seen a bit like Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers, somebody who was regarded as a traitor at the time, but I think now he's 85, and most people think of him as an American hero.
This is correct, I think. There is this concern, right? And obviously, I supported our publishing of Snowden when you were kind enough to include us in the later rounds. And I don't think there's any question that what Snowden showed people was very important to know. That said, I constantly get this question: who gives you the right to make that national security decision? Isn't it dangerous that a renegade consultant for the National Security Agency and unelected editors are making a decision about national security secrets?
Well, it could be, but the only way I can defend it is to say, do you believe in a free press? If your answer is yes, then the only sensible definition of a free press is a press that is independent of everything, independent of all forms of power, including government. And therefore, you have to have people in society who are called editors who are free to make those kinds of decisions about publication. If they make the wrong decisions, then by all means cut them off to jail and behave badly towards them. But if what you're saying is actually it has to be the government that has the override over the press, then it's not a free press. So yes, there are all kinds of risks and messiness involved in that, which you can only defend if you believe in a free press, which I do.
But if the press gets it wrong, what should happen? If you, in fact, jeopardize people's lives, this is the questions I get. But if you, in fact, you decide that you need to publish and you can't know everything that you can predict the consequences of their release, you release something that leads to the loss of lives. Government have a right to come after you as a news organization?
Absolutely. In retrospect. And I think that the New York Times and the Guardian and the Washington Post behaved responsibly in maintaining a dialogue with the White House and with Downing Street and with the intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic throughout. So we would say in advance, we're thinking of publishing something around this particular document. Do you want to come back to us and tell us any fears that you had? And most of the time, we listened with great respect to what we were told. And the people I spoke to who were part of that process did not raise undue alarm that we had done anything that they considered had led to the kind of consequences that you refer to.
Right, and of course the system works a bit differently in the United States. There's never been a prosecution under the Espionage Act whether a newspaper got it right or wrong. So the idea of something happening on the back to my American ears causes a bit of alarm. But in reading your book and remembering it, it causes alarm to me that you're also called before Parliament, right, to discuss this and ask, in what was an electrifying moment for those of us who weren't being asked, do you love your country? In your book, you seem to think that you should have given a better answer. Is that a fair reading?
Esprit d'escalier. I mean, we can always think of things we should have said. Yeah, I mean, I think I said something like, of course we love I love my country, and I love it because it actually believes in freedom of speech. And I think I would give a variation of that argument answer again tomorrow. I mean, also in the book is the moment where David Cameron sends his cabinet secretary around to say, okay, you've had your fun, stop publishing. And you had to say, well, actually, that's not your role in society. You can't tell me to stop publishing because it's a free press. And he comes back a week later and says, if you don't stop publishing, we will do something very unpleasant. It was never quite clear what he would have done, but I suspect that they would have injuncted us. This takes you back to arguments that Milton had in the 17th century about the right of prior restraint over publication, which was the same argument at the heart of the Pentagon Papers. So that's why we just said, well, we'll go and publish from America. I mean, I said to Cameron's emissary, we have a copy of this in America. We're talking to the New York Times. We will publish from America. And the deal was, in the end, we had to go through this piece of theater, which was to smash up all our computers in the basement of the Guardian, turns out it's harder to smash up a computer than you think it might be. So we had to hire all kinds of angle grinders and drills and literally pulverize these computers, which are now I think they're in the V&A Museum. And then we just published from America, because in America, I'm guessing it would be quite unlikely that the FBI would walk into the New York Times and start smashing up your computers.
I did not revel in your misery, but it was a brilliant day when a New York Times reporter showed up with what you folks had given us. We hadn't worked very hard to get it. And I have to say that Assange felt different because that was really the break from the past. You know, you weren't talking about a whistleblower with a file or even a set of documents. You were talking about a massive dump, and I did wonder whether that was going to be the one that finally triggered the U.S. government to come after the press. By the time Snowden came around, I felt that the reaction that we'd seen to Assange meant that nothing was going to happen if we published from that. I never envisioned we would have the current administration, so I'm back to worrying. But
well, they would never say this in public, but I had a sense of, of course they didn't want us to publish any of this, but given that it was out there and that somebody had it, I think they were quite glad it was the Guardian and the New York Times. In this sense, that actually there was nothing stopping either Snowden or Assange publishing themselves.
Right.
And Assange, in the end, did do that. And so therefore you've got states that have to live in the world in which a single thumb drive can contain 1 million documents. And what you had was two very responsible publications who were ringing them up every day and saying, what about this document, what about that document? And actually it was a process that worked quite well. So I think there was some sense that they were in fairly safe hands.
Before I get to the subject of money, let me come back to the one other place where the Times and the Guardian ended up partnering, and that's on hacking. The Guardian had done brilliant work on the hacking that was being done by the Murdoch titles. Shameful behavior on the part of journalists at other papers in this country, and the Guardian deserves credit for shedding light on that. Why didn't the initial story have the impact that I think you thought it might, and those of us sitting abroad thought it might? Ultimately, you decide that the New York Times should be let in on the story in the hopes of making a bigger dent.
Well, the story was about bad behavior and criminal behavior within a newspaper, but the much larger story was about power. And we've always thought, again, paid lip service to the idea of diversity of ownership of the press. And yet we'd allowed a situation where Rupert Murdoch owned 40% of the British press, and if you can remember it, he was trying to get full ownership of Sky TV at the same time. So he would have had an enormous, I mean, he did have an enormously dominant position in the market. And what we discovered when we published the first story, which was about a criminal conspiracy in one of the largest media organizations in the world, one of the largest organizations in the world. Can you imagine if that had been about a bank or an oil company, that there was a board-level conspiracy to conceal evidence of criminal behavior within the company? And I don't know if you remember, but the police announced they were going to have an investigation that morning. And we thought, well, at last, you know, we've hit the bullseye. And then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the police came out and said, well, we've looked into it and there's nothing to look at. The shortest police investigation in history. And the penny dropped at that point. So first of all, there was huge resentment of the Guardian because dog is not supposed to eat dog. And then we thought, well, this is very strange behavior by the police. And then the press regulator, there was something called the Press Complaints Commission at that time, announced they were going to look at it. They published a report saying the Guardian's behaved very badly and there's not a stain on the news of the world. So you thought, they're in on it too. And then you couldn't get any MP to say anything, perfectly rationally, apart from Tom Watson and Chris Bryant and a couple of others, because they knew that what was going on was an organization that was employing criminal means in order to dig up the dirt on people. And then you realize a lot of people in the press didn't want to cover it. So you live in a society in which you think there are lots of checks and balances, and if something topples over here, it's going to be all right because we've got the police or we've got the press. And you know, if we remember back, then the former editor of the News of the World was about to go into Downing Street to be the press secretary to the next Prime Minister. That was the point. I lifted the phone to Bill Keller and said, I think you might be interested because it might take the intervention of the New York Times for people to say, well, this isn't just a sort of mad story dreamt up by the Guardian, and right. That's how it turned out.
Yeah. Let's shift to talk about money, the title here being Truth Costs Money. I remember when I first became a newspaper lawyer, I was at the New York Daily News, and I went to an advertising retreat for all of our advertising sales force. This was in 2000. And the editor of the paper, Ed Kozner, was introduced to speak to the gathered advertising reps, and he said, it's so nice to be here. I'm the man who pisses away the money that you work so hard to get. It got fewer laughs than that. But your book is a testament to you as an editor deeply involved in trying to figure out how to obtain money. How did you feel that it was taking you away from journalism? A bit, but it's one of the great issues for news today. I mean, a very simple problem. Print was going like that, and lots of people were saying there will be no Guardian in X years' time because the last Guardian reader is going to die. Digital's going to go like that. There's no money in it yet, but it's pretty obvious that that's where the future lies. And so you had to jump off print onto digital even though the money wasn't there, and we didn't know the rules about how that was going to work. And I thought my job is to stop the Guardian from dying and get it ready for life, even if I can't, you know, make all the sums add up neatly, perfectly every 6 months. twice in the book, at the beginning and at the end, you quote William Goldman talking about Hollywood, that no one knows anything,
Yep.
everybody's guessing. You've now been away from The Guardian, you've been sitting up in Oxford thinking, do you know something about how to make news organizations survive?
No, it's still chaos. I mean, we're in an age of complete information chaos, including the money. I mean, the thing that we tried on The Guardian, and I don't know how applicable this would be to other titles, but I remember in 2012 there was an academic called Clay Shirky in New York University, and we invited him over because I thought we need to sit down with the readers so they have some idea of this revolution that's going on. And there was a Sunday morning, and Clay turned to all the readers and said, look, at some point you're going to have to pay something towards this digital thing, and I'm going to have a show of hands whether you would pay to have The Guardian as a private good, so that the person sitting next door to you would be very offended if you discovered that they were getting it for free, but you had paid. That was how news was paid for 300 years. And there were no hands went up in the audience, almost no hands. So he said, well, let me try a different model. What about as a public good, so that one person here will pay, so that everybody in this audience and everybody in Edinburgh and everybody in Britain and everybody in the world can read this, because actually the world needs access to clean information. And all the hands went up. And I realized at that point that Guardian readers in some senses saw The Guardian as a kind of sort of philanthropic exercise. It was a public good. It wasn't a private good. And it's taken, so that was 2012, and The Guardian has just announced they've now got 1 million people who are paying, who don't need to pay. None of them need to pay because they can read The Guardian for free. And I think there's this shift that we have to, in some senses, say, look, if we're living in a world of information chaos where 2/3 of people don't know what is true and what's not true, then we're going to have some really good sources out there. The BBC is one, National Public Radio is another, that are available for everybody to read. Because the counter experiment is to have elites paying for good news and everyone else reading the dross. And I don't think that leads to good societies and good outcomes.
Those elites would be the New York Times paid subscribers?
Well, I quote
Not to put too fine a point on it.
I quote Dean, Dean Baquet, who I revere as an editor, and I was at a dinner with him in New York, and rightly the New York Times was celebrating its model, which is putting the news behind a paywall. And at the end of dinner, Dean himself said, does anybody else share my anxiety that 3% of Americans now read the New York Times and 97% can't? And Dean's the first African American to edit a newspaper the size of the New York Times. And I rang him, I emailed him the next day and said, that was a remarkable thing to say, Dean. And he said, well, from my background, I'm concerned. I'm concerned that 97% of Americans make do with Fox News or worse, or talk radio. And
I won't ask you what's worse than Fox News, but go ahead.
and we know that the direction that's taken American politics. It's not good for the world.
Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that Facebook is looking to enter into arrangements with mainstream publishers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, to pay them for content that's going to appear on Facebook. That, if it comes to pass, would be a dramatic change in the model, right? Is that the answer?
I don't think there's going to be one answer.
Okay.
I mean, I think the New York Times has done brilliantly with its model, but it's the richest town and the richest country in America, and there's not much competition there. I hope the Guardian model works. I hope the BBC works. I hope Facebook does start paying proper taxes and paying publishers for the material that they're using. I don't think it's going to be a magic bullet, but there are going to have to be lots of different experiments. And people, I think this is sort of beginning to happen, that people are the penny is dropping, that nothing works. Let's stay away from the word truth. Let's just try the word facts.
Okay.
If you haven't got an agreed factual basis for society, nothing works. You can't have law, you can't have science, you can't have government, you can't have anything. And that's a bit the world that we're beginning to live in at the moment, where we just can't even agree on the basic facts or that there are such things as facts. And I think people are beginning to now realize that we have to draw back from that precipice. And it's a journalist's job to persuade them that actually we are quite good at that, and that, as you say, that costs money.
Should we think of journalism has been in a financial crisis in the United States. Local news is in a terrible state. Big cities, many of them are suffering, and I think it's worldwide. Should we think of the platforms as the enemy? I mean, it's the platform. Google dominates the digital ad market. It dominates the distribution of information. Should we, for instance, be turning to the regulators and saying, you got to stop these people because they're killing journalism?
Well, I do have. I mean, I wish they would pay taxes. I wish they didn't behave quite so monopolistically, and I think there's a case for breaking them up. But some of it, they're just doing it better. They have understood that societies have changed, and that we're not living in a time of scarcity of news where people waited with bated breath to see what the Guardian and the New York Times was going to say in the morning. It's not the world we live in any longer. And they are smarter technologically, and there is something about social media which we can be rude about, but there are 2.2 billion people on Facebook, so it must be doing something right that society has a need of.
I will point out that you don't quote the Daily Mail often in your book, but you did feel the need to quote them on Facebook, that Facebook is a deeply tarnished, filth-peddling, tax-dodging, pusillanimous, terror-betting behemoth which targets the vulnerable with bile and hatred. You did manage to get that in there, and I can think of nothing that's wrong with that, so good for the Daily Mail. Let me ask one question before we turn to questions, one last question. Are you nostalgic for the Cambridge Evening News? Was that better?
All right, well, there's an early chapter I just thought, in a book that describes a revolution and what it's like to live in a revolution. You just have to sort of describe what it was like before the revolution, because there will be people in this room who remember, but anybody under the age of 40, I guess, would have no idea what was involved in the manufacturing process of news, and the hot metal and the printing presses and the vans driven throughout the night and poking 10-year-old boys out of bed in the morning to poke. I mean, it was a Victorian system, but there was something that you just had to sort of say, well, look, let's remember what it was like, and then describe how all that was blown up, and then we can argue about how we're going to remake it at the end.
Was journalism more fun?
Well, my colleague Nick Davis, who did all the brilliant reporting on phone hacking, he wrote a book around about 2008, I think, called Flat Earth News, and he coined the phrase churnalism. And what he meant by that, he actually measured. He went into newsrooms and looked at what was going in, all these press releases. He looked at how many stories reporters now have to write in one day, sometimes 10 in a day, and he worked out that they had about 40 minutes for each story, having read the press release, no time to make any phone calls or to check the veracity of the press release, and then he measured the output, and there is something that I think any reporter will recognize, that in the advent of these mobile phones that dominate our lives, people, and we all bear our blame for this, that we demand news to be there round the clock, being updated minute by minute, and that has led to a journalistic culture, which I don't think is much fun.
Well, this will be fun. We're going to take questions, and I'm going to try to keep you short. Even though I'm a guest in your wonderful country, I am going to act like an American and become impatient and rude if you go on too long. Alan and I will be signing our books next door at the book signing tent directly next door when we finish here. So people have microphones? Okay, why don't you start down and give a microphone here. Is there somebody over here so we can teed up? And can you tee up the person who's standing right next to you? Is there a fourth microphone someplace? Okay, we'll go with that. Okay. There, you have one too? Okay. Why don't we start there? Okay, let's go.
Hi, Alan. Thank you very much for your talk. One of my big memories of The Guardian was just before the 2010 election, when you asked people to vote Lib Dem, and I wondered if, in the light of where we are now, if that would be reconsidered.
Well, ever since around about 1910, if you go back through the history of The Guardian, it has never been attached to any party. Labour, I used to have all these arguments with Tony Blair, who wanted The Guardian to be a Labour paper. And he said, you know, the Daily Mail's got the Telegraph, and they've got the Times, and they've got the Mail. Why can't we just have one paper on our side? And that's never been part of The Guardian's tradition. It's always had these two strands of progressive thought in The Guardian's background. And I think people forget. I mean, we went out to all the readers and we said, what would you like? And this was post-Iraq, and there was a lot of disillusion with the Labour Party at the time. And Gordon Brown, who I've got tremendous respect for, but he was struggling a bit in the role of Prime Minister. I think he'd been a genius Chancellor. And people forget that actually there was quite a lot of anger at the Labour Party at the time, and many of the values that The Guardian had about civil liberties and human rights and Iraq and so forth were more reflected at the time in the Lib Dems than in Labour. They then threw in their lot with the Conservatives, and we can argue about whether that led to a less bad government than there would have been or not. But as a journalist, you can only read in advance. You don't have the benefit of hindsight.
All right, let's go over here.
Hello. Aside from Fox News, because it doesn't really count, do you think that ethics is really dying in journalism?
30 seconds. Oh,
30
go ahead.
Well, you see, I think Fox News really does count. I mean, David would have a more sophisticated answer to that than I do. It's a different. I mean, individually, I know, most of the journalists I've ever met have been really decent, truthful, honestly motivated characters who behave ethically. I think there have been bad moments in history, and the newsroom, the News of the World was one of them, but not only them. We've now discovered that there's 70 million pounds worth of legal fees and damages being paid out by the Mirror. That's industrial level hacking going on there, in which journalists are forced to behave badly by the journalistic cultures that is set at the top. There's a chapter in this book about the Daily Telegraph, and bad things were happening in the Telegraph within the last 10 years, in which journalists were doing things they bitterly didn't want to do because that was the culture that was set. So I don't blame the journalists for this, but I think there are corporate cultures which if we are to win trust, then we can't behave like that.
So back up here, and go ahead, please.
I wanted to ask about an item online today by a journalist called Mark Davis, who identifies The Guardian, particularly journalists Nick Davies and David Lee, for setting up the damage that ended up happening to Julian Assange. I'm no fan of Assange, but I do feel sorry for him. And I wonder how you feel about him being in prison now. Because Mark Davis suggests that some journalists should be in prison as well.
David Lee and Nick Davis are two of the finest journalists I've ever worked with, and they're friends. And I know they went into working with Julian Assange as admirers of him, as lots of people are. The people who stood surety for him and put their money behind him and lost all their money because he then skipped bail. There's a wonderful book by Andy O'Hagan, who was supposed to be his ghostwriter. And eventually Andy realized that this book was never going to happen, so he just published the unauthorized piece. And it was a tale of people being betrayed by Julian Assange and falling out with him. So the fact that David and Nick fell out with Assange is a sad story. But to leap from that to saying that they are responsible for him ending up in jail, I think is I mean, I just can't follow that.
Let's go down here and then check the microphone up to the man with the light blue shirt.
Thank you. In an age where fake news is only going to proliferate and world leaders lie without any compunction, what, if anything, should journalism be doing differently?
I wish I'd asked that question.
Yeah. And
Thank you.
and I wish I knew the answer. There's a reviewer who said that in this book there are 530 questions and no answers. And that's partly what a revolution feels like. I mean, I think part of the answer is that you can't, I mean, most fake news is not generated by journalists. You know, journalists are by and large saying things that are factual and, let's use the word, true, or have evidence behind them. So the problem of fake news is being generated at a mass scale elsewhere by bad players and careless players and people who don't care about truth. So I don't think you can expect journalists, the journalists are never going to be able to compete with the scale at which they've been being generated. I mean, in a sense, we can't let ourselves off from this. You know, how often have we retweeted something without exactly opening up the cutting and working out if we've agreed with it? So we have to think of our own habits, and we have to think about harnessing probably the computer power that Facebook and the generators of fake news have in order to combat it. I think, given all the things the provisos I made at the beginning, so I think there are things about journalism that are going to have to change. Journalism is going to be more open. It's going to have to be more of a dialogue, I think. It's going to have to be more transparent about its sources. You start using links, footnotes, and anything that's going to try and convince people that we deserve trust. Beyond that, I think you just have to, I think Marty Barron was asked, you know, what are we going to do about Trump? And he came up with this phrase. He said, we're not at war, we're at work. And I think there's a basic element of craft journalism which is about just putting the facts out there, bearing witness, challenging power, all those things which journalists have done badly or well for 250 years, and we just have to carry on doing that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I keep coming back to is I think we also have to police the term fake news. You know, it's being used now. There is real fake news, and now Alan's done a great job explaining how to go after that. But is being used as a label for things that people disagree with, and completely creating a toxic atmosphere around the difference between journalism that matters, that somebody disagrees with, and the kind of misinformation you're speaking of.
I can't see who you're talking about.
We'll confer after.
When I was young, you got the news in the morning, you got the 6 o'clock news, and you got the 9 o'clock news. Is my life immeasurably improved by knowing stuff now?
Well, probably not, but it would be a brave. I mean, when these things were first invented, which was only 2006, I think, I was absolutely incredulous that anybody would read something on a screen that size. Do you remember that thought? You thought that people were going to read a newspaper on a screen that size? And then the next thing, I had the product managers and developers in my office saying, look, unless you update this every minute, we're going to go out of business, because actually that is how people are going to start behaving. So to some extent, as an editor, you're led by people's behavior. If the commercial people are building a model that is built on audience, and The Guardian ended up I think it now has something like 130 million people a month. We briefly overtook the New York Times.
Thank you for sharing. Next question.
They then overtook us again, but so which is a completely different thing from having 400,000 subscribers in print. Now there are people now who are trying to swim against this. There's something called Tortoise. Has anybody heard of Tortoise? Has anybody read Tortoise? Okay, 3 people in the room have read Tortoise.
It's slow. It's catching on.
It's slow. It's going to be so it's slow. This Tortoise is supposed to be slow news. It's about the climate rather than weather. You don't need to know all this stuff. We're just going to give you the big picture. And I think it's a wonderful idea, and there's some fabulous journalism, but only 3 people in this room so far have. So it's going to take some time to build up a model. There's somebody waving their hands very vigorously.
I think you're up to bat, right?
Alan, do you think it is anti-democratic 3 years after the event to allow the British public a vote to change their minds?
Yeah, but if I mean, no, I would let them have another vote.
Okay. All right.
Can I pick up something on the business money side of things? Google, as you said, uses all the content and gets all the ads and basically keeps it to itself. A very large proportion of the publications in the world outsource their advertising to DoubleClick. DoubleClick is owned by Google. You guys are really, you really should be quite smart people. Why on earth did you, contract out your chicken coops to be guarded by the foxes?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, this is partly the story of the book. So, I mean, and again, there are everybody in the audience will have their experience of technological change over the last 20 years. So if you're running a newspaper, half your journalists think this is crazy. We shouldn't be doing it at all. The money is still in print. There's almost no money in digital. So all the anchors against, the drag factors against changing are formidable. The revenues are going like that, and somehow you have to conjure up huge sums of money to hire hundreds of developers who are going to outsmart Google. And we didn't have that kind of money. Murdoch, who was 10 times richer than The Guardian, didn't have that kind of money. And as you know, the economics of West Coast startups are wildly unfamiliar to anybody who's worked in a traditional company. I think Amazon, which is one of the most powerful and potentially lucrative companies in the world, only started making a profit last year. I think that's right. So they had burnt through billions in dollars in cash before they had an operating business that worked. And I'm sure the same was true of Google. I think Uber is the same. So if you're running The Guardian or The Times, there's no way on earth that you're going to be able to match the technological sophistication to build something that's going to be better than DoubleClick.
All right, last 3 questions, and we're going to do this kind of lightning round here, and then up there, and then the last question over there. Okay. So do you have somebody there?
There's one down the front who's been waving very.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. I want to ask you what you think about the fact that social media are not considered publishers, because you said earlier in this conversation that you were willing to accept any responsibility for any harm caused, whereas they, of course, don't have that responsibility. So isn't there a fundamental injustice here that needs to be redressed? But is it even possible? Can they actually be responsible for the millions and millions of posts, billions of posts that they have every day?
Well, that's the thing that it's a brilliantly phrased question, because in logic, it seems right that we ought to judge Facebook like any other company. It's publishing harmful stuff and libelous stuff and invasions of privacy and hateful stuff and racist stuff. Surely they should be liable for that. But in a sense, one of the glories of Facebook was that for the first time in human history, it's very easy in the comfort of Edinburgh or London to say, we want to set these rules, but if you're living in Pakistan or Turkey or Egypt or other countries, Facebook is actually a tremendous lifeline of freedom. So when I keep reading these demands that this all has to be sorted out by next Monday and that Facebook must take responsibility, you then have the problem that you refer to in the second part of your question, which is, so how would that work? How would you actually monitor billions of pieces of information in advance of publication? Or even retrospectively, which they're trying to do in Germany, and where is the norm? Are you going to have 160 different norms for 160 different countries? So this is a non-trivial problem to try and solve, but I do think we have to keep the pressure up on them to acknowledge that at least it's a problem. I think until about a year ago, these companies wouldn't even acknowledge that it's a problem. I think they are now thinking about it really seriously, but it's not going to be a problem that's going to be solved quickly.
So the answer is yes, they should be held responsible. One up here, and then the last question over there. Back up there. Somebody have the microphone there? Yeah.
How can you square the aspirations you have for The Guardian as a progressive newspaper with its very statist attitude towards the aspirations of Scots to have a functioning, normal democracy, and for nationalism, just read democracy, that's all we want. And in Scotland in particular, virtually all the media are hostile to that aspiration. Is that reasonable?
The second part of the question is probably easier to answer than the first. No, it's not reasonable. And that's a very profound thing about who gets to make these decisions and who dictates them and how newspapers decide on lines. The Guardian has no proprietor. No one was telling us what to think, and we would jointly decide, sometimes by asking the readers as well, in order to get a sense of what we thought about issues. And I think the last time that you're referring to this question came up, there was a feeling that we wanted to keep the union together, rightly or wrongly. My own view may have changed on that in the light of things that have happened in the last 3 years, and the Guardians may have. But if they have, it will be an honestly arrived at view of people working there. So yeah.
All right. Last question. Short question, short answer.
Okay. I was wondering if you're worried about the future of journalism given the demise of local papers, not only for local news source, but also for the training of future journalists who usually cut their teeth there.
It's a terrible, terrible crisis. I chaired the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and we went up and sat in a pub with a bunch of reporters in Manchester and Liverpool, and these were people who could no longer go out and cover councils and courts, who didn't get their phone calls returned by the police. And you've got a sense of societies now that have no effective scrutiny or even a record of what's happening. And that's going to lead to terrible corruption and the kind of the sins of ignorance of simply not knowing what is being done in your name. And they're the ones that really have no financial model that anybody can think of at the moment. And maybe we can end on this note, because I think in the end it does come back to, if societies can't function without facts, then maybe we have to start reframing responsible media as a kind of public service. So we can't do without a police service and a health service and a prison in societies. And I think we have to have a clean source of information. And that if the market can't provide that, then we're in trouble. At the moment, 90% of Brits say they won't pay for news, so that they don't want to pay for it, and yet society needs it. And that's the definition of a public service. And I think that's where the debate is going to have to go in the next 10 years, because if we don't want local communities living completely in the dark, then we have to work out another way of paying for it.
Thank you, Alan, for pushing back the dark a little bit here today. Join me in thanking Alan.
Right.
You got your phone?